Welcome to CinemaScope, where we strip away the gloss and dive into the raw, unfiltered realms of cinema's most daring movements. I'm Andy Nelson, your guide on this quest to uncover the truth behind the lenses. Today, we're exploring Mumblecore, a fiercely authentic movement that trades polished production for unvarnished intimacy. With handheld cameras, skeletal budgets, and a fearless commitment to capturing the messy realities of everyday life, Mumblecore has redefined the boundaries of independent cinema. Join us as we trace its DIY roots, decipher its improvisational soul, and discover how this unapologetically honest style has forever changed the way we view relationships on screen. Joining me today for this conversation, I have a fantastic guest who is also well-versed in the world of Mumblecore cinema, Maria San Filippo. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Glad to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. You studied film. You're teaching film. How are you? What's your place in the cinema studies landscape?
Well, you've just said that I studied film and am now teaching film, and I'm doing that at Emerson College, which is in Boston. And I'm really just a cinephile at heart. Grew up as a film buff, wrote film criticism from an early age, and then managed to turn it into a way to make a living. So I think I must be in the right place, though, because you just mentioned that the show is devoted to daring cinema. And I think that's actually the link that brought me to thinking about Mumblecore, because I've always been interested in cinema that pushes boundaries. I've written two monographs, single-authored books, one about bisexuality in film and television, and the other about what I call provocateurs, filmmakers whose brand is structured around their being provocative in their work. And while I do talk about one Mumblecore filmmaker at length, no, actually two, Lena Dunham and Desiree Akhavan both get a chapter apiece in that book. I would actually say that Mumblecore is aligned with my focus on daring cinema, because I would very much argue that it is daring cinema, even if it might not be necessarily what people, think of first and foremost when talking about daring cinema. And even though it's been somewhat tangential to the kind of work that I focused on, which is typically about women and LGBTQ filmmakers' work or representation thereof, and in mostly contemporary American or English language cinema, and also television more recently, I've also been focused on, because how could you not? There's a lot of it, and it's really good.
Right.
So that's in a nutshell what I do.
This is going to be a fantastic conversation with you, because it sounds like it's going to be right in your wheelhouse as far as the types of things you like to study and the types of things these filmmakers are doing in these films, which is incredibly interesting. As we kind of get started with this conversation, let's kind of go back to the early days of Mumblecore. And, it emerged in the early 2000s. It's interesting to see. I mean, I grew up with independent cinema really kind of booming in the 90s, the Steven Soderbergh Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and a lot of that sort of independent cinema, which definitely feels different from where Mumblecore took it. I felt like the independent cinema in the 90s, people started wanting to be, what can I do that's edgy, that's different, that's, really pushing some bounds with I don't know, whatever types of style, like the violence or things, like kind of trying to track that Quentin Tarantino type of path or something. Robert Rodriguez, really inspired a lot of that independent cinema in the 90s. And then there's this shift in the early 2000s, and, cameras became a lot cheaper. You had a lot better access to affordable equipment, which certainly was a factor that kept a lot of filmmakers from really, making stuff when they were younger, because camera rentals were very expensive. Shooting on film was very expensive, a lot of that sort of stuff. And then suddenly you have this stuff where it's like they're breaking a lot of the rules, I guess you could say, as to like how you typically would expect a film to go, but they're still making incredibly compelling films. What happened? How did that shift suddenly make sense for people to say, yeah, this is something that I want to see on screen?
Well, I'll see if I can connect some of the dots there. And I'm glad that you started out by mentioning Sex, Lies, and Videotape, because I think that's a really key film, not only because, as the first film to get a $1 million sale at Sundance, it just kind of landed indie film on the map as a financially viable prospect, but also because I would say, unlike the other films you named or the filmmakers you named that do very stylized work like Rodriguez and Tarantino, and even somebody like Hal Hartley, has this very kind of aesthetic, identifying quality. With Sex, Lies, and Videotape, not only the content, but also the style was very unassuming, right? It was really almost a prototype of Mumblecore to come, because it really is just people sitting around in their homes talking about sex most of the time, or relationships the rest of the time. They're professional actors in that film, but they're acting very naturalistically. And I would say that's also, a progenitor of what Mumblecore would have. And just these kind of insular micro dramas of the everyday is precisely what Mumblecore would choose to focus most of its stories on. And I think that came out of several things. And you've already mentioned one or two in terms of the changes of technology, allowing more people to make films more affordably and easily, right? So just like, in the French New Wave, it was suddenly possible to take cameras out into the street and shoot sound and under bad lighting conditions, right, on location. You saw something similar happening in that early aughts moment where suddenly we had, Final Cut Pro and you could edit, on your laptop. We had YouTube, right? Very shortly thereafter, where you could upload your content and get lots of views and maybe go viral overnight, which is what Lena Dunham did with her early short film, The Fountain. And that launched, of course, Tiny Furniture and then Girls.
Right. Yeah.
The web series, right, on all of these file sharing sites and programming sites like MySpace, or what were the other early ones? They're already vanished in my mind because they're more or less defunct, I'm sure now. But
yeah, right.
They made for a forum to not only make the work, but also show the work and get the work funded sometimes, right, with crowd funded sources that the kind of early internet era allowed for. So all of that kind of enabled the process to get underway and then to, get scalable, however incrementally, and then maybe also then taken to the next level in terms of financing at a higher budgetary level. And that wasn't hard to do because the original budgetary level was zero budget.
So right, exactly. So low.
Yeah. And so the way that became possible for people like the Duplass brothers to then, actually make studio films after their debut feature, The Puffy Chair, got such acclaim at South by Southwest was because we were in this wonderful moment in which we were actually seeing what Mark Duplass went on to call later middle-class movies, right? These movies that were like $5 million, $10 million budgets, and they were able to get funding and exist in a not yet oversaturated mediascape just before, the streaming wars got fully underway. And you also had this wonderful, fortuitous outcome of the media conglomeratization of so many studios that were suddenly bought up by these giant, behemoths like Cablevision, that because they were able then to basically protect risk, they didn't mind setting up these what were called specialty divisions within their infrastructure, right? And those divisions would provide the financing for these low concept films that didn't seem like they would have much in the way of financial viability beyond a pretty niche market. But we were, already seeing the beginnings of Netflix. And so there was thereafter a lot more call for content, right? We needed to fill those libraries of movie subscription services. And then after that, over the top streaming on demand services. So it was just this wonderful moment, more than it was a movement, that allowed for this pretty fine-tuned indie aesthetic that certainly didn't appeal to everybody. It was, very much a specialized taste to find footing and to answer the call. And I think this is another really important factor in thinking about why did it come about when it did, to answer the call that actually the film critic for the New York Times, A.O. Scott, proclaimed that we needed what he termed a neo-realist movement. And he was, of course, hearkening back to the Italian neo-realist films of the post-World War II era that had this real economy of means, right? They were films that were made in the wake of war, in the struggling nation, and were about everyday people and their struggles, and used everyday people instead of, professional actors, and used on location sets instead of sound stages. I think Scott saw an importance in that as not just an aesthetic approach to making film, but also an ethical approach to making film. I mean, we were already by the turn of the millennium at a point when the typical Hollywood studio film, like the average film, had a budget of about $150 million. That's on average. And that's insane.
Yeah.
Quite frankly.
Right. No, they really kind of spiked. Yeah. Because, the 90s was like the indie film cinema kind of had this thing, but then Hollywood just kind of kept growing in this other direction.
Absolutely. They went for the tent poles, right? They put all of their chips into the blockbusters.
Some could say they haven't learned that lesson yet.
Yeah, still trying to learn that lesson. But I think what Scott saw was that there was this oppositional demand for something different. Right? Something to counter that Hollywood style that was more about, what had been kind of brewing already globally and was called there slow cinema. If you recall this term slow food that was sort of hot at this time, slow cinema was a kind of, tandem way of thinking about making films as very local and about duration oftentimes, right? These were films that kind of unfolded at a glacial pace, but they're very much about observation and contemplation of the world around us. And they were sort of used to resist this ever more hyper-productive world in which we're constantly working and constantly moving, right? And trying to push back against that. And I think we could see Mumblecore as an offshoot of that more global slow cinema movement and more neo-realist aesthetic and ethic that Scott was calling for.
And I think also after the boom of independent cinema in the 90s, film festival proliferation kind of became a thing. Like, it was crazy. Like, every community needed to have their own little festival. And I think that gave a lot of these filmmakers a platform to share their films, right? Before, when it was just those few big festivals, it was harder to get in. And so it was always just those few that were rising to the top. But once it just kind of kept growing, it allowed for a lot more of those voices to kind of be discovered.
Yes. And I think if Sundance were the key festival for those 90s indie filmmakers that you were referencing, South by Southwest is the key festival for the Mumblecore. And Matt Dintler is the person who was the kind of Robert Redford, I guess you'd say, of South by Southwest, right? This sort of impresario who programmed the festival and who loved Mumblecore and was one of the first people to use that term and used it very cannily as a brand, right? To group together this somewhat disparate, selection of films and filmmakers who didn't really like being grouped under this moniker.
Right, I know.
I think it really was a helpful way to signal through the increasing clutter of content, as we now have come to call it, that there was, if not a movement, a moment of exciting filmmaking happening. And it was being celebrated first and foremost in Austin at South by Southwest on big screens, which it would thereafter maybe not have as much opportunity to be seen in the theater, right? Because theaters were increasingly showing only those superhero movies, or they were shuttering, or we were just preferring to stay at home and watch things increasingly on our laptops and in our home viewing environments. And I think Mumblecore, going back to the question about aesthetics, really plays well to those small screens. They're very talky. They use a lot of close-ups on faces. They're often shot in these interiors, so they don't need these kind of panoramic vistas. They don't benefit from having, 70 millimeter projection. One of the Mumblecore, Andrew Bujalski, still stuck with making film on celluloid.
Yeah.
But most of the Mumblecore would increasingly turn towards digital video, which, we just touched on, but it's a very important additional factor here, that this was the digital revolution. What made possible the superhero movies and all of their CGI was also what was making possible the Mumblecore films with these, tiny digital cameras that you were able to shoot really cheaply on and then edit yourself, quite easily.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's such an interesting term. I know they don't like the term, but it is interesting how it kind of stuck, but it is a very handy term to kind of define this movement in film that we have here. It's kind of funny, having talked about Ozploitation a few episodes ago, that also is a term that, people aren't thrilled with, but it's stuck, and it really has helped, at least at the very least, kind of get those films being talked about and seen more often, which, so I guess there's a good and bad to it. But also, like, the interesting thing, Ozploitation is a very recent term that came from that the documentary that was made about it. Likewise, Mumblecore, it's not just a recent term, it's a recent movement. Like, this is like, perhaps, I mean, it certainly is the newest kind of genre that I've talked about on this show. And it's, it's all within the last 20-ish years that this movement has happened. So it's a very, very recent shift in independent film, which is, pretty interesting.
Yeah, people say it's the first major, or really the first and maybe only film movement, American film movement of the 21st century thus far. There were some other really exciting movements happening around the world that I think coincided with what I was saying earlier, was this slow cinema style or mode that became popular, like the Romanian New Wave or the Taiwanese films of Tsai Ming-liang. There are other people working across the globe, Hong Sang-soo in South Korea, who are making very Mumblecore-like films, but it was definitely a movement that was rooted in the US.
Yeah.
That moniker, however unfortunate, did stick. It is catchy. It came from a sound designer on one of the films, or a sound recordist, I guess, on one of the films, who, as we were talking about before the interview started, sound is so crucial and so hard to capture audibly and expertly. And this guy, Eric Matsunaga, was having a lot of trouble doing just that, because these people were talking off the cuff, improvised, right? There were very infrequently scripts, right? Full scripts,
sure.
The production of these films. And trying to really be in the moment and get that kind of fly on the wall capturing of people saying what comes to them is really tough. And hence, I guess, why they were thought to be mumblers. But I don't know. It's, I think, important to treat the films on their own, treat the filmmakers on their own, even while seeing these similarities or trends that tie them together. They're really all very individual as makers. That said, they all worked together, right? There's such a dense web of collaboration among these people.
We'll definitely talk about that as we go through our films, because there's a lot of collaboration as we will see as we talk through these films. Before we jump into the list of films, and again, we'll be talking about 5 films over the course of this episode, and then for our members, you'll be able to hear us talk about 5 more films in the after show. But we'll be talking about Funny Ha Ha, The Puffy Chair, Hannah Takes the Stairs, Quiet City, and Frances Ha, which should be a fun lineup. Before we jump into that, though, I mean, you talked about some of those core components, like we were just talking about kind of like the dialogue that they're just kind of coming up with on set. They're ad-libbing, and it's very naturalistic the way that they're performing. We talked about the video cameras, kind of the cheaper equipment that they were filming with. What are some of the other core components as we look at this that really kind of helps define what Mumblecore is?
Well, I think there was a real investment in letting things unfold as they would naturally, and yet being aware, as you have to be in that post-millennial moment, that you're being recorded, right? That you're on camera, right? Because these are kids that grew up, they are millennials, the people who made these films, right? So they were raised with home movies, with personal recording devices, right? Tracking their every move probably since birth. And then, we were in the early years of the internet. So then there was that factor as well, right? Where we were becoming more inclined towards virtual modes of communication. And then thereafter, ever more ubiquitous, a sense that our lives were mediated, right? That we were living on screens and that the moments of our life and our social lives, most importantly, were being chronicled, right? For posterity or, future humiliation, take your pick. But we were just kind of constantly on camera.
Yeah, right.
And so I do think that the Mumblecore filmmakers were very cognizant of that and of kind of living life as if in a movie all the time, right? And so these were films that oftentimes actually foreground or thematize filming. Oftentimes the characters, such as they are filmmakers, and they're playing a version of themselves, the filmmakers, right? So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of focus on what I think millennials are known for focusing on, which is this quest for authenticity, for realness, but also with this kind of awareness of irony, cringiness, awkwardness, that whole post 9/11 idea that irony was dead was clearly a miscall, because we saw a lot of what are called smart films in that era that were kind of existing alongside Mumblecore films. I'm thinking of like Wes Anderson or,
Sure. Yeah.
Even earlier, like Todd Solondz. These are films that are kind of Mumblecore adjacent, I would say, but they have stars, they have scripts, and they're very ironic and knowing, right? And knowing about media, but in a kind of distancing way. Whereas I would say Mumblecore is very knowing about media, but in a earnest way, right? Not so ironic and distanced. And they really lean into that appeal for intimacy and realness. And I think that's where the magic happens with Mumblecore, right? That's where you see this, I think, really kind of sometimes brutally, and oftentimes really movingly honest depictions of interpersonal relationality that do actually seem fairly unscripted, fairly natural. And I think we were looking for something maybe at this point that served to maybe regain a sense of trust in media, a sense of trust in one another, right? This is also the Bush years, the Iraq War years, right? And some people have accused the Mumblecore of being too solipsistic, of being too navel gazing, of being too white, of being too straight. There's a lot of allegations, some fair, or at least in part fair, sure, allegations to be made about Mumblecore. But I think there's also just a sense of humility about it, right? Instead of feeling like we as American cultural imperialists had the right to just go trample whatever foreign nation with our guns or our cameras, right? The parallel between the two has been made. These filmmakers were instead choosing to stay at home, quite literally, right? They were turning the camera on themselves and turning it inwards on their lives. And yeah, that is navel gazy, but it's also something that they knew. And they kind of, I felt like, maybe wanted to stay in their lane.
Well, and it speaks to the idea of like, what they tell writers, write what you know, and filmmakers, make something, do what you know, what you're close to. And I think for a lot of filmmakers, and I remember when I was in film school, I'm like, what does that actually mean? Like, is it just a story about like my life? What is that? And trying to figure out what that is. And I think this is a perfect depiction of that. I mean, it's not just young filmmakers, it's young characters, often the filmmakers themselves acting in it, or all their collaborators acting in the films too. So these are films about this group of people, these 20-somethings, trying to figure their lives out, right? And trying to make sense of everything that's going on around them. Anxieties about getting a job, not just a job, but a job that means something, as you were saying, like that is going to be important to them, where they can be making a difference, and trying to figure that out, and figuring out relationships and what does that mean, and just the idea of like, maybe you're already in a relationship, but how is that defining you now? Well, certainly in our member bonus, we'll be talking about Hump Day, Lynn Shelton's film, and there's certainly an element of that as Mark Duplass's character is trying to figure out, what does this actually mean? Like, why do I so desperately need to go through with this act? And so I think there's a real element to all of this that speaks to who these characters are. And you can write that off as navel-gazy. I get that. But at the same time, I just feel like it's these people trying to be authentic to who they are. And I mean, they're very open and vulnerable in a lot of these films, as regardless of how they're written. I think there are still a lot of vulnerability kind of shines through with the characters. And I think that's something that definitely speaks to the way that they're telling these stories.
Yes. And I would actually say, in response, one other way in which we could frame thinking about Mumblecore, and another way that I just intuited connects it to my other work. These are films about relationships, but I think we could call them not romantic comedies, but radical romantic comedies, right? Radical rom-coms, which is something that I edited a topic that I edited a collection of essays on, but also a term that's been around for a while now, because it really goes back to the 1970s, when filmmakers like Woody Allen and Paul Mazursky and others were making these romantic comedies that were about the way relationships really are, not the way we wish they were, right? With the wish fulfillment of Hollywood stylized romantic comedies. And I would say that these Mumblecore films are just that, right? They are films that are about the way relationships really are, especially in the modern era, when you don't wait to have sex until after marriage, right? You don't even have to get married necessarily. And trying to figure all that out, and also manage all the other things that the people in those Hollywood rom-coms never seem to have to worry about, right? Jobs, money, their friends, your peer group, your living situation, increasingly being in a relationship that was long distance, right? Because people are living all over the place, connecting via social media means, or at least, internet means. So I think those are all factors that really fuel a kind of resurgence for romantic comedies of not just the bromance, right, style that was coming to the fore at this time, but something like Hump Day, which was really, I think, a kind of anti-bromance, right? Or at least it was an alt bromance. And we can get into that. But yeah, I think a lot of these films you could actually think about as what, the tagline for Annie Hall, an awkward romance, right? Or was it an anxious romance? Either way, it's, awkward and anxious pretty much describes all of the romancing that's happening in all of these films, not all of which end with couple formation, right? A lot of them are uncoupling comedies where they break up at the end or never got together in the first place.
Right. Here's another show you can enjoy in the True Story FM family of entertainment podcasts.
Okay, now for the lightning round.
I'm so good at lightning rounds. That's from Friends. It's my favorite show.
20 seconds on the clock starts now. Who is the captain of the USS Enterprise?
Oh, crap. Is it, Captain Stubing? No, Morgan? Crunch?
Next question. Which superhero is Tony Stark?
Stark. Did Game of Thrones have superheroes? I only watched 2 episodes.
What planet were Luke and Leia born on?
Planet Fitness?
Oh, time's up. Sorry. And now, a word from our sponsor.
Hey, everybody. Mandy Kaplan here. Please check out my podcast, Make Me a Nerd, where each week an incredible guest tries to baptize this mainstream mom into the world of sci-fi, fantasy, and all things nerdy. Available wherever you podcast.
That's our show, folks.
Wait. I just thought of it. Padme Amidala gave birth to her twins Luke and Leia on Polis Massa. No, that's dumb. Is it Planet Hollywood?
You mentioned that kind of the idea of the radical romantic comedy, which is a really interesting way to look at it. Also, I think it's just like in the scope of calling this a movement or a genre. Would you say there are also some subgenres within it, or are they all kind of fitting into that element of it? I mean, they definitely all have humor and drama, and there's kind of the relationship. So I can see kind of that makes sense to call it that. But are there other things that we could also see that fall under Mumblecore?
Well, there's actually been an offshoot of Mumblecore called Mumblegore that is
Right, I've heard that.
sort of the brainchild, I guess, of people like Ty West is somebody who's often associated with them. The Duplass brothers, who were the sort of incubator for the Creep and Creep 2 films. And Duplass is actually in Creep 2 with Desiree Akhavan, another Mumblecore filmmaker, because, horror was becoming such a huge phenomenon along the same time, not so much in the aughts. I mean, we did see like the Saw franchise and the Hostel franchise in the aughts. The really key film, though, to mention here is The Blair Witch Project, which came out in 1999 at Sundance and had this really revolutionary internet campaign, internet campaign for publicizing the film and getting this kind of cult audience, right, to anticipate it's coming. And I think, Mumblecore took a nod from that too, right? That way of promoting yourself online and also just the do-it-yourself filmmaking that the Blair Witch Project so amazingly and memorably thematized through, its whole, how much of this is real conceit. So I think it's kind of fascinating, but, not improbable that Mumblecore gave way to something called Mumblegore, since there still is such an appetite for horror. And they did have that kind of, do-it-yourself aesthetic in common from the start.
I can imagine that people like Mark Duplass probably reveled in the fact that they could call it Mumblegore, since they already didn't like Mumblecore. Just like finding a way to just like twist that into something like that is kind of funny.
Yes.
Well, to really start understanding all these different components and everything, let's take this and dig into our first film. This is Andrew Bujalski's Funny Ha Ha. The story of this, Marnie is a recent college graduate, and she's navigating uncertainties of her adulthood, of romance, of friendship while in Boston. And as she's struggling to find direction and purpose, her interactions with her friends and potential love interests reveal the complexities of post-college life. So how does this film exemplify some of these components that we're talking about?
Well, it's certainly, as you were saying, a film that is about that listless feeling of being in between, right? That liminality that one gets. It takes place during a summer, which is this kind of liminal moment post-graduation, but before, the workforce seems to really be calling. So you see Marnie just kind of hanging out, working a temp job, going to parties at night, or, going out to dinner with friends and feeling like she doesn't have a clear purpose, right? Or a clear sense of where her next move will be. And so she finds herself falling into relationships, right? Very passively, even if she's not entirely on board, right, with the attentions of some of these suitors, or are they really sincere in, their seeming enticements to her, right?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think it sets a prototype for Mumblecore to come with all of its cringe-inducing scenes. Bujalski himself plays one of the supporting roles as a suitor, and he's, I think, great in the role. But I think he's also canny enough to know to take the back seat to his star, Kate Dollenmeyer, who is wonderful in the role. I don't know if she's ever really acted since. I know she's gone into this really interesting career as a film archivist and preservationist, but
oh, wow.
I thought she gave a really appealing performance and is also, our female protagonist. And I think this is important to mention because so many of, especially the first generation of Mumblecore filmmakers, at least the ones that were being touted, were men, and they would often be about men characters, and Bujalski, or at least men protagonists, right? Central characters.
Sure.
And Bujalski was and is an exception to that rule. Not to say he never made a film with a male protagonist, but I think, he's made some really fine films about women's inner lives that I think he does intuit quite movingly and effectively.
Yeah, right. This was 2002, and it's kind of referred to as like the first Mumblecore. I mean, I know there were some things potentially. I mean, it's always an evolution as things are growing and changing. But is it just all of this, like the way that it just the conversations feel awkward but authentic in some way? We're following Marnie; she's trying to figure out what to do with her life. it's funny. This is one of those, you read the reviews and it's either people who really click with it and just like absolutely love it, or people like, what am I watching? Why am I watching this boring film about this person who can't figure out what to do? And like, they just can't click with it. And it's just like really strongly bifurcated as far as like opinions on the film. Is that part of like the evolution of Mumblecore? Like, it hit this point in filmmaking where this is what people were getting, and some people who got it were like, yes, finally.
I certainly felt that way when I saw it. Right. It struck that chord with me. It had local interest, I'll confess as well. It was actually shot in Cambridge, close to where I'd gone to college, and actually has some scenes set on the campus of my college. So that was exciting to see as well. So I liked that aspect of it. But I think, more importantly, it had this feeling of getting the characters, right, that I thought resembled me. I'm a little older. I'm Gen X, so not quite seeing these films at the age that the characters who are portrayed are. But remembering back, having those 20-something post-collegiate years recent enough in the rear view that I could maybe appreciate them from a more distant perspective and not be as tormented by them as some seem to feel they were torturous. I get the sense that people who find them torturous, it's because they are so slow. And again, it's all relative. If you've seen the films of someone like Tsai Ming Liang or Jia Zhangke or the Romanian New Wave filmmakers, then that's slow, right? These films are actually not that slow, and they're not that long either. I mean,
no, they're all very brief. Very brief
because they were cheap. So, I think with Bujalski, he was touted as being the kind of second coming of his mentor, Chantal Ackerman, who he studied with at Harvard, where he'd recently graduated from.
I was going to bring her name up when you were talking about some of those slower films.
Exactly. Speaking of slow cinema, she wrote the book. And so, I think, he was treated by some of these early critics and fans as having this kind of more, bona fide artistic flair or credentials. He shot on film, Funny Haha was shot on 16 millimeter. It won awards, right? He was given an Indie Spirit Award. It got some good reviews. People like, Dennis Lim and Amy Taubin, who were singing his praises, right? These respectable critics who saw in his work something that kind of harkened back to filmmakers like Cassavetes or Soderbergh, who saw that beauty that came from being able to let things unfold without a kind of dictatorial control that we have come to associate with the auteur, right? It was a different mode of directing where you got to get out of the way instead of telling people what to do, right? And I think they respected that. Critics and fans respected that.
It's a very different way of telling these stories, because they do feel like sometimes the camera just lingers on one character through a whole conversation, and it's like a directorial choice where we're not doing cut shot reverse shot over the course of the conversation. It's just, we're going to just hold here. It could be budget. They could be just saving on film by just getting it all here. We got it. We got everything we need. But it also could just be part of the way that they're choosing to tell the story. And it's like, it gives us a sense of that unfinished feel, and kind of it does lend to it feeling a little more raw. And I think that's an interesting element that you have when they choose to do it that way. Another element that we certainly see here is we're definitely starting to see how collaborative it is. Like, aside from a number of the different faces that we'll be seeing over the course of these films we're talking about, just how layered they are in the credits as far as many hats, right? They're all just, it's like, it's indie filmmaking at its core. It's like, we're all just going to jump in together and we'll do whatever job we need to get the thing done. And I think that's a real exciting element that we have in the way that we are certainly seeing here with what Bujalski puts together, but certainly as it kind of continues going.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like about putting on the show, right? You got to get the movie made. Everyone's chipping in. And that reminds me of another, I think, important factor here that Mumblecore was growing out of and responding to, which is reality television, which had become this kind of juggernaut by, the aughts, because there were these big hits like Survivor, but also because it was cheap to make. And that would become, increasingly important once there was a strike, right? There was, the last big strike in Hollywood of labor, resulted in their needing to find something to put on television, and reality TV became it. But also, just because, those so-called reality shows weren't so realistic, it came to be known, right, that they were very not maybe scripted, but certainly they were designed, right? They were, people were provoked into having dramas on camera, and then they were edited selectively, right, to hype the drama even more. And so I think these are the same kind of structure. You put a bunch of people in a house, right, and see what happens. But they weren't about getting these big dramatic climaxes. They were about documenting the microdramas, right? The, more muted tipping points in relationships among people of this age.
Well, that gives us a good sense, talk about funny haha and a lot of this. We've talked about the roots of Mumblecore. Let's jump into the rest of these films and really kind of explore how this movement really kind of came into its own and continued to evolve over time. The first that we have in this, the rest of our list is Jay and Mark Duplass's film from 2005, The Puffy Chair. And, the first thing that I suppose you could say we're getting here is there's a little bit more of a story here, right? It's actually like a musician. Josh is a struggling musician, and he decides to go on this road trip with his girlfriend, Emily, to give this old purple recliner that he has to his dad as a birthday gift. And so they're going to drive down the coast and give this to him. Along the way, they stop and pick up his quite eccentric brother, Rhett. And over the course of the rest of the film, it's really navigating the relationship with his brother, with his girlfriend, and kind of figuring who he himself is over the course of the story. And I mean, really, this is one of those where you're talking about relationships. This certainly takes a less than Hollywood ending approach with the relationship for sure. So let's talk about this. I had a lot of fun with this. I had never seen this one before. I've always enjoyed the Duplass brothers and the things that they do that I've seen of theirs, but I had a lot of fun with this. What does this really kind of epitomize, I suppose, as far as what the Duplass brothers were bringing to storytelling in the scope of Mumblecore?
Well, I rewatched this one because it wasn't that fresh in my mind in anticipation of talking with you today. And I was really glad I did because it was even better than I remembered.
It's a lot of fun.
It's really stood up. Yeah.
The whole bit at the hotel when he doesn't want to pay for 3 people. And like that whole thing was just laugh out loud funny, leading to his like brother finally like, this chair is cursed, like burning it in the parking lot. Man.
Yeah. It's terrific. It's terrific. I highly recommend it. And I, was reminded of Katie Aselton is a wonderful actor. I wish she acted more. She went on to become Duplass's wife in an interesting, I don't want to spoil too much about the film, but there's a really interesting way to think about this film as the road not taken in Duplass's relationship with Aselton, his still wife and a filmmaker in her own right of the Mumblecore. And from the first scene of this film, which I've shown over the years in my romantic comedy courses as an example of the kind of inciting incident that leads a couple to have to struggle to stay together or to question whether to stay together. We call these comedies of remarriage, right? These are comedies in which the couple, it's not about getting them together, it's about getting them back together, right? As Stanley Cavell once famously formulated it. And so this is precisely that type of film, right? The opening sequence shows in agonizing detail just how dysfunctional this couple is. And, they talk baby talk because they can't really face up to one another about their needs and desires and say the words that need saying. So instead they like cajole and coddle with baby talk and deflect and get really furious and overturn the table and stalk out. And that sets this road trip in motion. And it's a road trip, right? So as you said, it does have a story. It's got a very linear narrative that borrows from the hallowed tradition of the road movie. But of course, it changes it up with this odd cast of eccentric characters and this mission, which isn't to like find America or be on the run from the law, but rather to deliver this hideous chair, this maroon velour chair to, the character that Mark Duplass plays, the two brothers' father, who was played, in fact, by the actual Mr. Duplass and
right.
his wife, Mrs. Duplass. The only one of the Duplasses who's not in the film is Jay Duplass, who was behind the camera at this point, and he would go on to become a well-regarded actor in Transparent, among other projects. But at this point, he was still behind the scenes. So it kind of seemed like Mark was going to be the on-camera brother and Jay the behind-the-scenes brother. And Mark certainly shows his star quality here, his leading man status, his gift for comedy and improvisation, you know, who'd be an actor in many of the other Mumblecore films, including Hump Day. But their bond as brothers and creators who are partnered, well, not any longer, but were for many years partnered, I think really comes to the fore here because they did what they do best, which is that they worked together under a scarcity of means to make something and then to get it seen through really ingenious abilities to connect and speak about their work and to also just be at the right time and in the right place because Netflix came calling, right? You know, this was the moment when they were able to make this sweet deal at Sundance where they'd already had a short film screen to have their film released through early by mail, red envelope era Netflix. And that made all the difference. It got the film seen and promoted and got them to their next film and thereafter. And they've really managed to build not only this brand, the Duplass brothers, right, as brands, but also they are great mentors to other filmmakers.
Very important. I mean, we'll get like when we talk about Tangerine in our member bonus, that certainly was something that came about because they were behind it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll save that for the latter.
Yeah, no, it's great. Hey, get them excited to sign up for memberships, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so there's a lot of Mumblecore elements in this. It does feel very low budget, improvised, all that. And we should just say, this isn't like Dogma 95. There's not like this rigorous set of rules. If you're not following these rules, then it's not Mumblecore. You know, it's not quite like that. But it definitely is this low budget, independent style of filmmaking. You know, their parents are in the movie. Their parents largely paid for them to get this movie made, right? They were behind it. And I think this does feel very improvised, and the way that the relationship unfolds, the relationships really the two brothers and then the boyfriend and girlfriend over the course of the film. I mean, it speaks again to that youthful period in time where you're trying to figure your life out, your direction, your purpose. Again, is he going to be a musician? He's now trying it out to be a manager and all this. Is that really working? He doesn't seem happy. His brother, meanwhile, is like filming lizards crawling on trees and is like a whole different view on life. And so trying to figure out who you are and then again your relationships. And I think that's a big part of this film.
Yeah, and of a lot of other Mumblecore films too. I think you've hit it on the head here that masculinity is really being questioned and troubled. You know, it's a sort of arrested development for some of these male characters where they're emergent adults and yet they're really questioning, what is my purpose? What is my career? And also, you know, why marriage, right? Why is that such the, you know, path that is expected of me? And questioning that becomes, you know, the core of what Mark Duplass's character does here, and has this really, you know, staggering conversation with his dad about how, you know, his dad just found himself married one day and how, you know, having more agency over one's life choices might be a better path to take. And I think we'll see that in a lot of these Mumblecore films that are looking at American masculinity at this era post 9/11, right? Where I think this new generation of young people is questioning all of these values that especially America has put on men. You know, our president was at that time, you know, evoking Top Gun and sending troops into the Middle East and just that kind of militant aggression, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Being equated with masculinity is something that I think, you know, young American men were pushing against or made to feel very vulnerable if they weren't living up to. And so trying to comb through that conundrum, right, I think becomes a major topic of introspection for the male protagonists of these films.
And the female protagonists, too, as we go, because the next film we're talking about is Joe Swanberg's 2007 film, Hannah Takes the Stairs. It's about Hannah, she's recently graduated from college, and she's now trying to figure out a number of different relationships over the course of the film. Mark Duplass is in it as the first relationship that we see end pretty quickly. She's working at a production company. Speaking to your point about these are people who often are in the industry, right? They're working at a production company in Chicago. She's trying to figure herself out with her relationships, with her job, and just kind of dealing with all of these challenges and, again, uncertainties of young adulthood. But that's definitely a big part of all of this. So, I mean, at what point are we? Let's just take a quick step back and look at Mumblecore from 2002. This is 2007. The last of the films we're going to be talking about is Frances Ha, 2012. I mean, it's about halfway through. Would you say we're kind of at a peak of when Mumblecore exists? Is there an easily definable peak of Mumblecore?
Well, I would say one key year is 2005, the Puffy Chair release year, because it was the kind of miracle year, as they call it. That's the term they use for the year in which the French New Wave, first big films of the filmmakers most associated with that movement, came out. And we have something similar here in 2005. We have 3 first films by Mumblecore key filmmakers come out, or at least I guess in the case of one, it was the second film, because the so-called godfather of Mumblecore, Bujalski, had already made Funny Haha. So he makes his second film, Mutual Appreciation. Swanberg makes his first film, I guess that was LOL. I might need to be fact-checked on that. And the Duplasses, of course, made Puffy Chair. And the South by Southwest confluence of those 3 and the naming of Mumblecore right at that moment was huge. Now, by 2007, that's just a couple of years later, but Swanberg is just notoriously prolific. I mean, the man makes multiple films a year. And so I'm not even sure how many films he'd made by this point, but I know in the space of a very short time, maybe just a year or two, he made 2 films in close collaboration with Greta Gerwig, the Hannah of the title. And while she did not get directing credit on this one, she did, in fact, get co-directing credit on the other film they made around this time, Nights and Weekends, which I really like as well, and which I think may have been a better experience for her from what I read about the kind of history of making Hannah Takes the Stairs. I think it was a difficult shoot, and I think Swanberg works in this most extreme of Mumblecore fashions, where it really is kind of like a commune as the production is underway. Everyone's living together. A lot of times are involved romantically, or at least sexually, with one another, are oftentimes on screen, unclothed, engaged in certain intimate acts. He's really the kind of Fassbinder of the Mumblecore. I mean, he really pushes buttons and guided/coerced people into going into really raw territory in their performances.
Well, that speaks to that intimacy. That speaks to the sense of authenticity that we're getting from these when they appear so vulnerable, right?
Absolutely. And also, I think it just, in some cases, and I'm thinking of the last scene of Hannah Takes the Stairs especially, it just serves to kind of desexualize the human body that, in Hollywood history has always had such barriers around being shown nude, and just such kind of heightened fetishization of nudity, especially female nudity, and using nudity so ubiquitously, but also so playfully as Swanberg does, and so naturally. I mean, the first scene is of Greta Gerwig getting dressed for work, and when you're getting dressed, you're naked for part of the process, and so just making the human body just so natural, I think it's an asset of his work for sure, but also something that got him a lot of flack and was challenged in terms of some of his choices made on set that he's since expressed some regret about. But he became a far more, I would say, controversial filmmaker of this group, and got some really derisive reviews from people like Amy Taubin, who called him lazy and saw nothing of value in his work. Then again, he has his adherents. Richard Brody, the New Yorker critic, famously put 2 Swanberg films on his top 10 list in 2011, which is amazing in and of itself. And then also when you think about that he made 2 films in that year. He might have even made more than 2 films in that year.
I'm looking right now. He made 6 films in 2011. 6 films. That's one every other month.
Yeah. And according to Richard Brody, at least a third of those were,
wow,
very noteworthy. Yeah. So he was really making films in this just completely intuitive and roll with real life way that I think is really exciting and led to moments of, sheer greatness, but also a lot more kind of loosey and unstructured than both Bujalski and Duplass.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and just to confirm, Kissing on the Mouth 2005, LOL 2006, and then this in 2007.
Yes.
Very busy. And only gets busier. That's crazy.
Indeed.
You mentioned Greta Gerwig, and again, the collaborative elements of this. This is the one, I watched a lot of these back to back, but I believe this is the one that had even the credits seemed very collaborative in like how it described all of the different people and how they kind of came up with the idea and worked on the story and put the thing together. And I thought that was really interesting and really spoke to the whole nature of what we're getting with these stories. And I suppose particularly with this group of people who are just very much a team, and you said like some of them romantically or sexually, they're all involved, but certainly in the work, they're all very much tapped into this type of storytelling and figuring out how can we make these stories and get these out there. And I think that's a really interesting aspect that I think that is something I really have never seen. I mean, certainly you've seen people like Tarantino and Rodriguez connecting and deciding, let's help each other. And there was that point in the 90s where, and I'm going to forget the other filmmakers, but they did that 4 Rooms film, the anthology film, and that was a group of filmmakers who they were all kind of working and boosting each other up over the process of making a number of different films in the 90s, but it never felt as collaborative as this. Like this is like crazy how much a team this really feels like. All of these people, a rising tide lifts all boats. Like they're all just like, how can we work together to just tell these stories and make everybody's films better? And I think that's really exciting to see as they're coming together. And perhaps that speaks again to all of the stuff going on with how they're dealing with the spirit of the times, the zeitgeist with everything going on in the country, in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. It was really communal and collective. And, it stopped short of being, I guess, politically codified movement in the way that, you could argue others have been in the past. But I do think that they all shared a sense of urgency and also ability, right? They weren't going to wait for somebody to give them a job or to give them the money, right? They were just going to make the work, and everyone chipped in and they learned it as they went. And then it becomes this like dense web of like familial relations when you're watching these films, which pays off for the fan, right? The Mumblecore fan who's kind of, patting themselves on the back for recognizing all of these interrelated figures that are, making the music for that film, but also for that other film, or, are playing these bit roles, but are also Mumblecore filmmakers themselves. And they're working in different places. I mean, Swanberg's films are so deeply connected to his hometown of Chicago, or I guess his adoptive hometown of Chicago, and use Chicago, right, as a kind of character oftentimes, certainly in his latter films like Drinking Buddies or his Netflix show Easy, right? Chicago's definitely a character. So even though they're maybe, geographically disparate, there's nonetheless, I think, a real familial connection that grows ever more interconnected and dense as more and more films are made, especially by Swanberg.
Yeah. Is he the most prolific of the Mumblecore filmmakers? I mean, looking at his list, it's crazy how busy he was.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you count up all of the films that the Duplass incubator has, fostered into being, they might, challenge his number. But in terms of ones that have directed by Joe Swanberg on IMDb, I think he probably has the longest list. But you're right, as you pointed out about the opening credits of Hannah Takes the Stairs, it's all too much the case that he was willing to give credit where credit was due. And it always kills me when my students who are so excited about Greta Gerwig, which I'm so excited about, tell me that her first film was Lady Bird, and her first directorial feature was Lady Bird. And I have to point out to them that in fact it was this film called Nights and Weekends that they've never heard of. And she is an electric actor, I would say. She just lights up the screen. She has total star quality. You want to watch her do whatever she's doing, no matter how banal. And she shows that from her first, appearances on screen in these Swanberg films. I totally respect her choice to go direct and not be an actor any longer. At least that's what she's saying for now. And she's made some unbelievable world-changing films. But I do have to say I miss getting to see her act, because she really gave these films so much energy and a lot of heart and a real female perspective that sometimes they were lacking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definite presence that she has here. And as Hannah trying to figure her life out, this one feels very much like the sister, I guess you could say, to Funny Haha, in the scope of she's maybe now Marnie, who has a job and is kind of doing what she wants, but now she's trying to figure that relationship stuff out and trying to kind of sort through that still. And I think that speaks to just the way that people grow and evolve, and they latch onto one thing, but there's still other things they have to figure out. And I enjoyed that about this film quite a bit.
I do too. I mean, it's really about her growing a conscience in the sense of what it means to be in a relationship, right? And, you gather that as a young, fetching, flirtatious, intelligent woman, she's had a lot of suitors, and she hasn't always treated them or the relationships with them as, I don't know, maybe carefully as she could or should, arguably. And I think that's the real tipping point in Hannah Takes the Stairs for me, that she gets involved with somebody who has mental illness and struggles with it. She has to take that on, or at least grapple with whether, right, to take that on, and the kind of repercussions that even these supposedly casual flings of our 20-something years, right, can have for people. That it, hurts to be heartbroken, or to orient your life, towards somebody and have them not reciprocate. So in that sense, I think it's doing something really interesting with the radical romantic comedy again.
And also the relationships with coworkers, which is
yes,
definitely creates some tension as we get to the other relationship at work that she's in, and how that changes things. Yeah,
absolutely. And that gets ever harder because the line between work and life are dissolving, right? Those lines are dissolving. They're dissolving because we're increasingly like gig workers, right? That don't work for the corporation, but rather for ourselves, essentially. And oftentimes out of our home, even more so now, post-pandemic. And, we're talking to people that are our colleagues, but they're maybe in the same house with us because we're living in an expensive city and have to have roommates. Yeah. So there's just all of these lines being crossed that were formerly very firmly drawn and are disappearing before our eyes. And maybe that was safe in college, right? But it's not so safe once there's a paycheck involved and upward mobility is at stake. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Hey, Pete, have you ever been fascinated by the allure of secret societies throughout history?
Are you kidding me right now, Andy? I live for this stuff. From the Freemasons to the Illuminati, I am obsessed with these clandestine groups. The Rosicrucians and their ancient wisdom, the Skull and Bones Society at Yale with its powerful alumni network. I'm drawn to them. There's something about how they offer this exclusive access to hidden knowledge. They totally capture my imagination. It's like they give this sense of belonging to something greater than oneself.
Wow. Sounds like you're looking for one yourself.
Do you even need to ask? Where do I sign? How much blood do I have to give? Are there any required tattoos or brands involved? Is it my first or second born that they need?
Well, what if I told you that there's a secret society for film lovers right here at the Next Reel family of film podcasts, all proud members of the True Story FM network, and you don't have to give any blood or either of your kids?
You've got my attention, Andy. What can you tell me about this cinematic brotherhood?
When you become a member of the Next Reel family, you gain access to a treasure trove of exclusive content, early episode releases, and a community of passionate film enthusiasts who share your love for movies. It's like being initiated into a secret order where you're privy to the inner workings of our shows, including the Next Reel, the Film Board, Movies We Like, Sitting in the Dark, and CinemaScope.
But Andy, as a member, will I unlock a world of bonus content from extended conversations and behind-the-scenes insights to exclusive pre-show and post-show discussions that expand the conversations about the films we love?
Why, yes, the true power of this secret society lies in its community. As a member, you'll join an exclusive group within our Discord community where you can engage in clandestine conversations with other passionate film fans in our members-only channels.
But what about live recordings, Andy? The sacred rituals of any good cinematic order. Will these episodes be scheduled in advance so that members like me will know when to gather around the virtual pyre in real time via YouTube?
Ah, yes. Perhaps the greatest secret of all is that by becoming a member, you're not just investing in your own entertainment, you're also supporting the tireless work of our independent creators and helping to keep the magic of cinema alive and well. So if you're ready to join this elite group of film lovers and unlock the secrets of cinema, head over to truestory.fm/join. For just $5 a month or $55 a year, you will gain access to a world of exclusive content, engaging discussions, and a community that shares your passion for movies. Head to truestory.fm/join to sign up.
Andy, I can't wait for you to welcome me into the inner circle of the Next Reel family of film podcasts. I'll see you in the secret chambers. Now, when do I get my ring?
Well, we don't actually offer rings with your membership.
Tattoos or brands? When can I do that?
No tattoos.
Secret handshakes?
Tell you what, you and I can come up with our own secret handshake, okay?
No, I mean, at the very least.
The next film on our list, we're kind of continuing relationships, and this one, perhaps after watching it, I mean, it may have topped the puffy chair as far as my favorites on the list. It's Aaron Katz's 2007 film Quiet City, and speaking of Swanberg, he also stars in this one. This story is about Jamie. She's a young woman who comes to New York City trying to connect with a friend there, and she ends up meeting Charlie as she's trying to figure out where to go, and Charlie lives here. They meet as she's asking for directions. They end up spending time together, exploring the city, going to the parks, and they end up developing this connection over this period of time. This film, I loved. I love these sorts of stories of this happenstance where you meet somebody and it just turns into this connection. And is it going to last? Who knows? But it's a connection that is important and might change something in you. And, you know, we haven't really brought up Richard Linklater in the scope of like those 90s indie filmmakers, but certainly you can see something like the Before series in a film like this, where it took some of the Mumblecore aesthetics and some of those Richard Linklater, over a 24-hour, however long period of time, we're going to follow these characters as they kind of grow this relationship. There's a little bit more of a shift in I guess you could say there's diversity in the way that Mumblecore stories are being told and evolving here. I mean, what are we getting out of this one as far as like what's it showing as far as how Mumblecore is growing and changing here, and the filmmakers are experimenting with it?
Well, I'm so glad you brought up Linklater, and I love the Before trilogy more than life itself. So yeah, that was certainly what I was thinking of when I first watched Quiet City. I admit I haven't seen it in a long time. I have this very kind of ephemeral memory of it, which I think suits the film itself, because it does have the sense of the fleeting hours of life and trying to connect in the moment and be present when you find yourself suddenly, with somebody who you do share some connection to, however fleeting. And the Before series was all about that. And yet, as Linklater always is very clear about, those were highly scripted films, right? They had to be, because they were so tightly choreographed. And would guess that Quiet City is not nearly so. I don't know as much about Aaron Katz's working method as I do about the other Mumblecore directors. He's always been the most kind of minimalist, and I would say also most unassuming of, or maybe least put into the spotlight of the Mumblecore core filmmakers.
Oh, interesting.
I mean, he's been celebrated. He had a Harvard Film Archive retrospective when he only had 3 films out, right? Pretty early on.
Holy cow.
into the movement. Yeah. So, I mean, he's been given his just due, but yeah, I think his films and maybe also his own, kind of directorial persona is a little more unassuming. And he hasn't made nearly as many films. He's not nearly as prolific as somebody like Swanberg. But I think his films are really special. I think this one is beautiful. And I think the title says it all. I mean, it's a film that uses silence so effectively to speak volumes about the place and time. Something really profoundly significant about these Mumblecore films is that they serve as these time portals to this past that's a very recent past, but it's already, I would argue, pretty far gone. In this case, this not yet fully gentrified Brooklyn that they're roaming around that day. And it's so quiet and full of these empty spaces. And that speaks so thematically to the, isolation and the alienation that these characters feel, right? They're lonely people.
Yeah. It's like they're in another world here. They're in their quiet little bubble as they walk around.
Exactly. Yeah. They're kind of protected from the reality of the world beyond them, right? That they have to figure out, and the relationships that are kind of on hold or, that you're recovering from, as is the protagonist, from a recent breakup.
Right. And it is interesting because, so far, like it's a lot of New York films, these that we're watching over the course of this conversation. We have a Chicago film that we've talked about. We'll get to San Francisco in our member chat at the end, but there's a lot of New York here. And I don't know, when I hear Quiet City, I don't think of Brooklyn. And so I think that's a really interesting element that Katz chose to tell with this, because watching this film, it is incredibly quiet. We're seeing a side of Brooklyn that I don't think people necessarily think of when they're talking about just kind of like all of New York City, right? It just always is the bustling, busy life that they portray as New York. And this is a shift. And I think that's a really interesting element when we're looking at these young people and these stories of people who they're in the big city, right? They're trying to make a life and a living for themselves, but there's something about their life that feels separate, as they don't necessarily feel connected, and they're trying to figure out is like, how do I connect to the rest of this big city so I can be a part of it? But there's something kind of keeping them separate, and that's an element that we certainly have here with Jamie and Charlie as they're wandering through with this connection, but still trying to figure out what are the next steps.
Yeah. And I would say that they're somewhat similar to Funny Ha-Ha's protagonist or some of these other characters that are in between relationships or foundering around trying to figure out what is, a relationship or what kind of relationship it is to be, as well as having that wandering in the professional sense. And of course, that's all being, maybe projected would be the word, outward onto the city, right? Which becomes this space for navigating and wandering of sorts. And it's beautiful. It's a lovely look at a New York that I think has, largely vanished or maybe was never there really, except on celluloid, or in the interstices of, a quiet afternoon. Very different energy than the next film that we're going to discuss. And we're not necessarily needing to turn to it just yet, but I would say that, yeah, that film is all about trying to bend the city to your will somewhat, like, being a hustler, as opposed to these slackers, right? Jamie and Charlie are slackers, or at least maybe depressives, right, or lost and abandoned, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the character in Frances Ha is trying to find her way, but with like desperation, as opposed to kind of more quietude in the sense of Quiet City. She is scrambling to try to figure out, how to survive in this incredibly expensive place. And it's become ever more so in the years, that separate the two.
Yeah, I just, there's something about it, and maybe it is the fact that they're just feeling so disconnected. And I mean, there's a scene in this where they end up going to this art show, and there's one of Charlie's friends kind of gets on him for not socializing and stuff like that. And I think that speaks to an element. It's just a lot of it. It's just these people, like, they want to be part of this world. They're going out, they're doing these things, but there still is something that keeps them from connecting properly, perhaps, as they're, again, just kind of going to, like, how do I make it through this world and this life and everything, and dealing with breakups and the pain and everything. And maybe there is depression here, as you said, that is a part of it. And maybe that's why these two people do find this connection, kindred spirits and all of that helps them at least navigate this next 24 hours and come through it, maybe on the other side a tiny bit more positive and everything.
Yeah. And, to bring up rom-com yet again, I think it's a kind of inverted or introverted, maybe, twist on that pretty noxious trope of the manic pixie dream girl, right? Where in rom-coms, you'll see this down and out guy who's, upset for whatever reason, have his spirits and ego lifted by some whimsical woman's materialization, as if her only purpose were to cheer this dude up, and I think this film is far more than that. And it's the more everyday version of that, right? Where you see in another human some reassurance, right? You're able to, live another day or love another time and open your heart again and get out there again. And, if you've ever lived in New York, I have, and I remember, especially for somebody who's introverted or maybe also depressed, it's a grueling city, right? To throw yourself out into the midst of. Some people are very electrified and energized by it. Other people are depleted by it, And speaking of the city being a character, I think we get that from Quiet City, right? That it's a scary place, and it's easier to have a kind of, a wing woman in this case to brave it.
Yeah, right. No, it was a great film. I was really glad to have watched it because it was, I don't know, it's definitely something special. I really enjoyed the journey that they took on that one. And that takes us to the final film on our list, 2012's Frances Ha, directed by Noah Baumbach, who is a regular in Greta Gerwig's life for sure, as they're still collaborating. This is a story about Frances. She's a dancer. She is wanting to make it onto the main troupe of this group that she works with, but still is kind of working in the wings. And over the course of the film, she's trying to figure out adulthood again, and friendships, and finding her place in the world in some capacity, quite literally, as we're watching her address. This brilliant bit of storytelling, watching her address change over the course of the story, as essentially are chapters in the film. And over the course of it, she's struggling with her best friend Sophie and their relationship, which is put to the test over the course of it, as she's trying to pursue her dreams of being an artist and really trying to figure out who she is over the course of the film. Definitely jumping from 2007 to here with this film, Noah Baumbach, certainly, speaking of 90s independent filmmakers, fits into that group. Are we hitting a point with this where we're kind of starting that shift from Mumblecore to post-Mumblecore, as we're starting to get like known and respected independent filmmakers from the earlier days kind of jumping into it to tell their own stories? Are we seeing a changing landscape in Mumblecore, post-Mumblecore, just the independent movement in general?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that Greenberg, their first collaboration, Baumbach and Gerwig, that is, was that bridge that does link the Mumblecore to the 90s indie filmmakers, but that also maybe links Mumblecore to a more mainstream, right, level of audience and funding, and also a bridge between Mumblecore and what I named earlier in the coinage of Jeffrey Sconce's smart cinema. Baumbach was certainly one of these so-called smart cinema makers, smart film makers of the 90s. His early films were all very talky and, very overeducated people, usually young men, right?
In that Whit Stillman group of storytelling.
Yeah, grand ideas, kind of outwitting one another, right, with their highfalutin theories. Whit Stillman is another of these. And so kind of joining forces, my hot take on the Baumbach-Gerwig collaboration is that she makes him better. I'm not sure he always makes her better. The jury's still out on that. But in the case of Frances Ha, certainly in the case of Barbie, I would argue to the death that they make each other better. And both films, however different they are, result in really amazing outcomes. And I love Frances Ha. It's a film about female friendship. It's a film about uncoupling with your best female friend. And that's something that, I feel like I've been through multiple times as a woman. And it's painful. It's as painful, if not more painful, than the heartbreak that you feel at the end of a romantic relationship. And it's also, I think, a really strong film in that it is looking more unflinchingly at New York and at class than a lot of these kinds of films do. However indie they are, right? They might still not, bother to question or even notice that money, right, is a real issue, that work and class divisions and class mobility or immobility, and the costs of choosing to be an artist as a career, right? Most of even indie films, much less Hollywood films, right, don't give all of those concerns any attention, any notice. And I think Frances Ha absolutely does. It's still a very romantic film that allows, the heroine to have a sort of happy ever after. I won't go further in spoiling it, but I do think that it is more open-eyed about the literal costs, right, of the creative life and just life in a creative city in the second decade of the 21st century.
And as a character, she's a character who has figured out what she wants, right? So we're actually following a character now who's gone through that work, knows she wants to dance, and she wants to not just work in the office as she's kind of demoted to, but she really wants to do her own thing. She wants to have that. And I think that's a key part. Like, it's not so much, she certainly still has some exploration that she has to figure out as far as work, but she already has it figured out as to what she wants to be doing. And I think that's a key part of, as we've been seeing kind of these evolutions. And this one really does focus on the friendship and really trying to figure out that bond and how to kind of continue evolving a relationship as your own lives are changing. And I think that's a hard thing for some people to figure out. Like, can we continue being friends as we both start growing and changing in different directions? Everybody kind of goes through that going from high school to college. Like, some of those friendships you can you continue with, some of them you kind of lose touch with, even after college, or even later in life as you're moving out and not roommates anymore and you're shifting and you're kind of growing. It's like, we maintain that? And I think that's an interesting aspect that you have here.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of a wonderful and I would say radical romantic comedy from the 70s called Girlfriends, which the filmmaker Claudia Weil made as her first feature and one of the only women directors working in Hollywood, certainly in the 1970s and really even adjacent to Hollywood in the US. There were so few women making films. And she made this amazing film that came out in 1978, I believe, about just this, right? Two women, both wanting to be artists, a writer in one case, a photographer in another, whose primary bond is with one another until it's not, right? Until a man comes between them or their careers come between them or their interest in having a career, but also a family, right, comes between them and having to navigate that. It's a romantic comedy of sorts, I would say, because it has a lot of the same concerns of having it all, balancing, right, all of the desires one has with the need to compromise if you're going to share a life with someone else. And it brings feminism in both cases, I think, into the mix quite powerfully because, you know, now women are promised, right, that they can have it all and they're given opportunities to, you know, have careers in fields like art, but it comes with real costs and compromises, and having to figure those out is challenging and you know, requires some risk of loss.
Yeah, for sure. There is kind of this sense that Mumblecore comes to an end? I think, I don't know, reading about it, it's like, is it over? Are we in is there post Mumblecore going on now? And I mean, certainly the filmmakers, we've talked about a number of them and how once they've shown some signs of success, Hollywood came calling. They ended up making some films for bigger budgets and everything. The Duplass brothers had Cyrus, and we start seeing these filmmakers doing things that are a little bigger. Did it end? Is it post Mumblecore by this point? We're going to be talking about a couple films in the post show chat that are in the teens. Are they post Mumblecore? Like, how does all of this kind of evolve by this point?
I think there was some closing of doors to the ability to make this level of work and get it shown or get it sold and distributed. In 2007, we had this downturn economically, the Great Recession, as we call it. And that led to the shuttering of a lot of these specialty divisions that I referenced earlier at the studios, and a lot of the boutique distributors that could no longer stay in business. And so there was less of an arm for financing and circulating this work. The web series that we saw a lot of around this time that was a sort of launching path or launching pad to films like Tiny Furniture or Appropriate Behavior, which we'll talk about, that ended up segueing into, in the case of people like, the creators of Broad City or High Maintenance, into gigs in television. I mean, television's doors were opening as some of these other doors were closing.
We haven't mentioned that, but certainly we'll start seeing like some of these people jumping into TV as kind of like the influence of Mumblecore making that shift too.
Exactly. Yeah. So when you jump into another platform, then things get more diffuse and it's harder to kind of corral a Mumblecore together in the same way.
Well, you're certainly not getting those micro budgets or kind of the do-it-yourself like raw look that you're getting in TV at that point.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You might be getting some of the same style of content or storytelling, and you have this additional asset, I think, to make it more serialized, right? So that you can trace it over time, even more effectively than in an 80-minute movie. But you lose something certainly. And I think another thing that, contributed to this is just the super saturation of content that we are still wading our way through.
Yeah. Other
modes like podcasting, right, that come to the fore and compete for our eyeballs. Video gaming is, also escalating significantly in these years. I would say one thing, though, that we'll talk about more in the bonus segment that was happening with the original Mumblecore, which was never as much of a boys' club as it was kind of billed as being. There were always women there from the start, not just on screen, but behind the camera as well. But it became more inclusive, right? There were stories being told that were not only about heterosexual, cisgendered, white, emergent adults, right? They were still mostly emergent adults, but we started to see people who identify in all sorts of other ways making films or on screen in films that I think could legitimately be claimed for Mumblecore.
Yeah, that's definitely an important part. We'll definitely be talking about that as we get to Jenkins and Akhavan and Baker. Like they're all definitely making some things that fit that as far as the shift in Mumblecore. It's such a fascinating topic, and looking at the way that Mumblecore has really changed the independent film market largely, and what people are looking for, what people are making, how they're telling their stories. And as you mentioned, like how they're starting to tell those stories in television and everything. It will be interesting to see, like, when are we going to get that shift in the video game world? Is that going to come? Is there going to be like a more independent style of video gaming that happens? I don't know. I guess we'll see. But
I'm told that it exists. I'm so not part of that world, so I have to just take it as I hear.
I just saw Elijah Wood tweet something about a video game he's excited about, which is like people listening to playlists or something. And I'm like, oh, that's, and maybe there's more to it, but I was like, okay, I guess there are those sorts of things out there that people can connect to that isn't just running around and killing people in a battlefield, so.
I guess so. Yeah. I guess it's like something someone said about another form of media that if you can imagine it, they have a video game of it. I suppose that's where we're at now.
Yeah, probably. Well, I mean, this has been a great conversation, Maria. Thank you so much for joining me to chat about Mumblecore and really kind of explore these films and this movement, because I think it's such an interesting, and I know it's definitely not for everybody, but I think learning more about it and the way that they tell their stories, I think it's important to look at just to understand how, at this point, not just independent cinema, but really how cinema has been evolving. And I think that's a very important thing to look at and discuss. So thanks for being here for this conversation.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's very adaptive, right? At its heart, Mumblecore is an adaptive, right, mode of making films. And I think at our point in time where it's all about the death of cinema, we keep hearing that ring tolling, right? And it never actually quite happens. But I think Mumblecore was able to roll with whatever, was flung at it in some really difficult first 2 decades of the century. And I'm grateful that we have a really, I think, memorable movement, let's call it a movement, to usher in this millennium. And we have the millennials to thank for it.
Yeah. Well, having not seen as many Mumblecore films until this episode, I've got to say I really enjoyed exploring these. So again, thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
So, all right, before we go, do you have anything that you want to plug, Maria?
I would love to plug something that not everyone might be able to see, but I'll hold it up anyway. And this
absolutely.
Is my book on a Mumblecore film called Appropriate Behavior that we'll be talking about in the bonus segment. It's part of a series called the Queer Film Classics that's published by McGill Queen's University Press, formerly by another press, Arsenal Pulp Press. And I think there's probably about close to 20 now of these books that each individually treat a significant queer film classic. Mine is the newest, not the newest in terms of date of publication that came out in 2022, but it is the one that treats the film that is the newest and the most recent classic in the bunch. And that seems like an oxymoron. But I hope to have made a clear case for why it is, I think, to be regarded as a queer film classic. It is the first feature film of Desiree Akhavan, and it is a queer romance and maybe an uncoupling comedy, radical rom-com, but certainly a film about a bisexual Middle Eastern New Yorker who is trying to navigate all of those identities and also the throes of heartache. And I love it so much that I wrote a whole book about it.
Fantastic. Well, find it where you can. If we get links, we'll make sure they're in the show notes so everyone can check that book out. It sounds like a fantastic read about a fantastic film. So very much looking forward to it. All right, everybody. Well, remember, before we close, members, don't forget about our special bonus segment. We are going to be exploring 5 additional films that showcase the evolution of Mumblecore, the emergence of post-Mumblecore, and the movement's enduring impact on independent cinema. These films are Medicine for Melancholy, Hump Day, Tiny Furniture, Appropriate Behavior, and Tangerine. These films offer a fascinating glimpse into Mumblecore's ability to tackle a wide range of themes and experiences. If you're not a member yet and you want to join us on this extended exploration of the Mumblecore movement's impact, visit truestory.fm/join to access the exclusive content. Next month, we'll venture into the captivating world of Brazilian favela films. This powerful subgenre offers a multifaceted look at life in Brazil's sprawling slums, where the romantic vision of vibrant communities collides with the dystopian realities of poverty and crime. As we navigate the narrow alleys and confront harsh truths, we'll explore how these films illuminate the complex experiences of favela residents, sparking global conversations about inequality and social change. Join us as we discover stories that emerge from the margins, balancing hope and despair, leaving an indelible mark on our hearts. Thanks for joining us on CinemaScope, part of the True Story FM Entertainment Podcast Network. Music by Orcus and The Hunts. Find us in the entire Next Reel family of film podcasts at truestory.fm. Follow us on social media at The Next Reel, and please rate and review us if your podcast app allows. And remember, your cinematic journey never ends. Stay curious.
Andy, according to my friend Internet, this is what Letterboxd is. Letterboxd is a global social network for grassroots film discussion and discovery. Use it as a diary to record and share your opinion about films as you watch them, or just keep track of films you've seen in the past. Showcase your favorites on your profile page.
That is a lot.
You bet it is. That's why I want you to tell our fair listeners just one thing you do with Letterboxd that has changed the way you watch movies. Let them have it.
Okay, are you ready for this?
So ready.
I love lists. As of today, I have 246 lists in my account. I use them to track the movies I watch, organize them in all sorts of different ways. I track them by hand. I clone lists from other people. I use them to plan what I'm going to be watching, all sorts of things. I love creating lists. It's a fantastic tool.
Sexiest animated characters. Andy, what is this?
We love Letterboxd, and if you're a movie lover, we are sure you will too. And when you upgrade from the free account, you will remove ads and support the great Kiwi team building this amazing service.
Just use the discount code NEXTREEL or visit thenextreel.com/letterboxd to get 20% off your pro or patron membership. And it works for renewals as well.